Welcome everyone to our public lecture. If you're coming for the first time, if you've been here before for our events, it's delightful to see so many of you in attendance to hear our eminent speaker, Professor Stefan Collini, speak on the humanities, past, present, and future with a question mark, so I don't know quite how to inflect it. My name is Ram Prasad. I'm Distinguished Professor and Deputy Dean in the Faculty of the Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences, newly named to include humanities in it, in recognition of the fact that our faculty has always had a range of humanities subjects of varying sizes and strength over the years. So we have, at the moment, humanities spread across 2 of our 4 schools, in the School of Arts and in the School of Global Affairs. And they include creative writing, English, theatre, media, design, art, languages and cultures, history, philosophy, and the first department at the time of its founding in the English-speaking world of its kind, religious studies, to which I happen to belong, hence that little puff. As the incoming Vice President of Humanities at the British Academy, I'm delighted to have Stefan speak on this important topic, which I'm sure is going to serve as a kind of manifesto, even if he thinks that he's going to say something realistic and modest, nevertheless a manifesto for all of us, seeking to continue to articulate the importance of humanities in a very difficult world, socially and in the universities. So Stefan Collini is Professor Emeritus of Intellectual History and English Literature at Cambridge, and also Emeritus Fellow of Clare Hall, where I was once a research fellow, so that's my claim to fame with him. And he has, of course, written many books, and he's a fellow of the British Academy. If I were to list all he's published, of course, we'd just take up the rest of this evening. But chief among his writings are Matthew Arnold, A Critical Portrait, English Pasts, Essays in History and Culture, Absent Minds, Intellectuals in Britain, and also, as he's continued to write in the core of his interests in intellectual history and English literature, also his 2 books which contribute to the debates over the humanities and the universities, What Are Universities For? And its sequel, Speaking of Universities. Back in 1999, when English Pasts, Essays in History and Culture came out, a reviewer said that the author was writing at the height of his powers. 26 years later, there is no diminution, it would seem, in Stefan's intellectual powers. So without further ado, I'd like to invite him to give his talk.
Well, good evening, everybody. And thank you, Ram, for that elegant introduction, especially because I have to say, I find when you go somewhere as a visiting speaker, and especially at my age, the introduction can sound ominously like a draft obituary. You know, and I kind of think it's going to end with some phrase such as, and he died after a short illness. So I'm grateful, Ram, that you entirely avoided that problem. I'm also, as you can perhaps see, not, rather unfashionably, going to be using PowerPoint. So I will simply talk to you. That's despite the fact that when I do use it, my students say they like it, or, as one of them put it in a wonderfully unguarded moment, yes, we like it. It gives us something to think about while you're talking. So you'll have to listen to my talking. Now, I think we might as well begin by being honest that any event or discussion with humanities in the title does risk being both predictable and depressing. I think it risks being predictable because there's bound to be some kind of upbeat affirmation about the great human values that are involved. And I think if we're honest, we find as we get into those very abstract terms and so on, it gets a bit sort of pious and therefore a little bit lowering, and that it's depressing because despite that, the news that any speaker has to bring about the humanities, as most of you in this room will know, cannot at the moment be very good news. In fact, as you follow these things in the newspapers, you'll know that the humanities can seem more beleaguered and more besieged at the moment, possibly than ever. Numbers of students enrolling, not just in Britain, but elsewhere in the world, are dropping. Colleagues are, let's be frank about it, losing their jobs. Some departments are being closed. Some students are being denied courses. These do seem very grim times in that way. I think the trouble is that in response, those who then want to speak up for the humanities can sound somewhat defensive, a little whinging, perhaps, and a little, I'm afraid, self-satisfied. So it seemed to me important on this sort of occasion not to contribute to that pattern. And I want to try and do something a bit different tonight. I'm going to adopt a very long historical perspective in order, as it were, to try to relativize our current concerns. So often when people lament that something that they value is going to the dogs, they nearly always assume some earlier state that was not only superior but also in some sense natural, the given, the way things were and should be. But of course in reality there are no such earlier states. That state of affairs that they think they're going back to was itself the product of historical change, and often rather recent, and the state we're in now will similarly be affected by historical change. I'm not going to stay at that abstract level the whole lecture, don't worry. I will bring us back to the present, but I think it's helpful to have that in mind when you think about this sort of historical story. I noticed the other day something I was reading. It was said of the Scottish historians of the 18th century that all their accounts began with Noah's Ark and came down slowly to the reign of George III. Well, I have to tell you, I'm not going to take quite such a long run-up at this, but I do want a quick dash through the 19th and early 20th century just to help situate the later debates. So, at the beginning of the 19th century, there were only 2 universities in England, and there were only 2 subjects that could be studied for a degree, mathematics and classics. The situation was, of course, different in Scotland, which, even at that date, had 4 universities and a much more varied and, I think, ambitious curriculum. And in the course of the century, new universities were founded, initially at London, and then in the major cities of industrial England, such as Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, and so on. And the range of subjects was widened to include things like physics, chemistry, history, law, English literature, and so on. And as institutions grew, administrative divides became essential to making sense of things. And the structuring divide in British universities from the late 19th century right up to the late 20th was between the arts and the sciences. And I expect everyone here who is of a certain vintage, I'm not near enough to see the wrinkles, but I see a certain amount of grey hair, so I think those who are of a certain vintage will remember that those were the categories within a university, the arts and the sciences. And in fact, the 2 most important people below the Vice-Chancellor in those days were often the Dean of Arts and the Dean of Sciences. That was the terminology. Now, of course, there was a hierarchy of prestige among disciplines that made up these 2 groups. And I think one thing that's hard now to recover is the extent to which classics still enjoyed such unchallenged cultural and educational supremacy. For so long, education had meant classics that even as other subjects established themselves, the cultural ideal represented by classics retained this indisputable prestige. I think it's usually a bad idea to confer any extra significance on elite institutions that already get too much attention, but I can't resist citing here my favourite statistic about this, which is that at Eton, as late as 1936, there were 4 history masters, 9 science masters, and 39 classics masters. Now, when we're considering the possible decline or even disappearance of subjects that we have for so long considered to be central to the university, I think it can be salutary to remember the trajectory of classics. For many, at the beginning of the 20th century, it seemed unthinkable that classics should ever lose its educational primacy. But of course, a dramatic shrinkage was to take place by the late 20th century. However, let's also remember that it turned out that that shrinkage did not mean the end of civilization, but actually the discipline of classics in our universities has morphed into a small but notably lively area of teaching and research. It's also important to remember in this story, I think, that although the civic universities were founded in what were the great manufacturing and commercial cities of the age, this did not mean that their curricula were to be confined to narrowly practical and utilitarian subjects. The founding fathers of universities in Manchester, Liverpool, Sheffield, and so on stipulated that what one of them called the customary university subjects were to be taught. And although the popular image of these universities has them associated with the growth of sciences, in fact, when I looked into the numbers, I found that by the 1880s, the majority of students were doing arts subjects. The Baxter family, who in the late 19th century founded what became the University of Dundee, were representative in being, as a contemporary source described them, less concerned with the teaching of science than with elevating the tone of society and raising minds above the pursuit of money. And that attitude and the cultural deference that clearly underwrote it played an important part, I think, in sustaining the position of what we have come to call the humanities for the next 100 years. Now, I say come to call the humanities because the currency of this term is relatively recent. And I just want to spend a few moments tracing its evolution. When I read a recent book like Renz Bodd's book, A New History of the Humanities, that ranges from ancient Greece to the present, I'm in awe of the scale of the learning on display, but I feel bound to raise a skeptical eyebrow at such a confident trans-historical romp. The humanities from ancient Greece till now. It's certainly legitimate to have a survey of learning across 2 millennia, but to see that learning as somehow constituting past examples of a category that did not exist during those centuries, I think raises some doubts in our mind. A bit like when sociologists want to talk about the contribution of Aristotle to sociology. We feel there's some danger of anachronism here, even though there may be purposes for which that's useful. It doesn't represent an actual historical continuity. So if we're to take a historical approach seriously, I think we have to recognize that the familiar and apparently solid category of the humanities is a distinctively modern notion, invoked in particular circumstances, which I'm going to say something about, and in response to specific challenges. Now, some of you, I apologize if you're familiar with the prehistory of the word, but let me summarize. It was used very sparingly in the 19th and early 20th century, and when it was used, it was to refer to the study of the classics of Greece and Rome. And that sense survived for a long time in the Scottish universities, where, for example, at Edinburgh, the professor of Latin was, until the mid-20th century, termed the professor of humanity. It's always important in these cases to try to separate out odd outlying remarks and usages from what is any general change in meaning and usage. So, for example, it's true that we can find one mention of the term in Matthew Arnold's work, and that's led some people to rush to recruit him as a champion of our current concerns. But when you look more closely, you find that what he says in the key passage, this is in his famous lecture on literature and science, when we talk of knowing Greek and Roman antiquity, which is the knowledge people have called the humanities, and so on. In other words, a quite different sense from the modern usage. And I also noticed, by way of further example, that the modern sense of the plural form, the humanities, has no entry in the first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary, which, with its first supplement, came out in 1933. The only sense given there is the old-fashioned one of the study of the ancient Latin and Greek classics. So the sense of the humanities, which refers to a group of academic disciplines within a university, first began to claim any currency in the interwar period in the 20th century in the United States, especially as a response to the success of the supposedly more scientific methods of the social sciences. I quote the American historian Lawrence Vesey. In fact, not until the 1940s does one discover a sudden outpouring of books and manifestos with the humanities in their title, using the word with an entirely new frequency and insistence. And I think what the work of Vesey and other more recent historians shows is that the term gained traction as a way of referring to historically important and treasured intellectual enterprises, which now risked seeming to be sidelined by the more positivistic world of the modern democratic American university. And this sense of being both a residual category and one that is on the defensive has arguably never been lost. Now, after 1945, the term starts to become a bit more common in discussions in Britain. So, for example, recently reading a run of issues of the then new journal Universities Quarterly from 1946 to 1950. Yeah, I know, I should get a life, but anyway, that's what I was doing. Reading a run of the issues of that journal throws up frequent instances of the term, but not in any consistent usage at all. So the most striking instance I found was Sir Richard Livingston, who was at the time Vice-Chancellor of Oxford University. He wrote a piece about the range of subjects in British universities that began by the sciences, I shall mean natural sciences, mathematics, technology and medicine, by the humanities, I shall mean the rest. So, as I say, the local dominant organising category throughout that period remained the arts. And official statistics still used that category to cover all the non-sciences. It seems to me that changes in the internal character of some disciplines played a part then in subdividing this capacious category of the arts. Subjects such as politics and anthropology went through very considerable internal changes in the half-century after 1945. Politics, moving away from the older concentration on political thought and constitutional studies and towards empirical US-style political science and increased quantification, while anthropology divided internally between forms of social anthropology that attended to questions of cultural meaning and interpretation, and much more materialist studies having closer kinship with disciplines such as economics or even biology. And those changes helped to make it seem more natural to class politics and anthropology alongside subjects such as economics or social psychology, rather than alongside, say, classics or English. So the growing prominence of the social sciences in the middle and later decades of the 20th century was, I think, one of the key drivers of the currency of the discourse about the humanities. And that tallies, I think, with the evidence that it starts to appear after 1945 and becomes much more common after 1960. But these usages, as intellectual historians well know, can coexist at the same time. So the celebrated Robbins report of 1963 largely retained the traditional division between the arts and science subjects, although for some purposes, it's interesting, it subdivided the arts into humanities and social studies. And it noted that the number of students taking social studies courses was growing at the expense of those doing humanities subjects. And that this was alarming because, as the report put it, any decline or weakening in the study of the humanities would impoverish the intellectual and spiritual life of the country. And it's hard to know, I think, which characteristic of that remark to be more struck by. The fact that the humanities are, as so often, already being seen to be, in some sense, on retreat, or the sheer confidence in an official document of the unargued case for their importance to the intellectual and spiritual life of the country. I haven't found that phrase very often in recent government statements. But to take an exactly contemporaneous contrast, in David Daiche's description of the new, radically iconoclastic University of Sussex, where I had my own first job, we find him staying with the traditional distinction between the arts and the sciences. He expands the range of the arts, not just English, history, modern languages. He includes American studies, international relations, other then relatively new fields. But all through his discussion of the arrangements, the schools that were formed internally, teaching methods and so on, he speaks about the arts, occasionally with social studies mentioned, but nowhere in that document, that long document about the founding of the University of Sussex, can I find the term humanities. And yet, a celebrated book published as a Pelican original in the very same year, one or two of you may remember seeing this, Crisis in the Humanities, published in 1964, edited by J.H. Plum. Now, what's remarkable here, I think, especially noticeable in Plum's introduction, is the absence, first of all, of any epistemological or methodological anxieties about the status or the ways of working of the relevant disciplines in the humanities. And second, the absence of any concern with questions of justifying public funding or appeasing that always grumpy, supposedly beady-eyed figure, the taxpayer. And those are the two forms often cited for the alleged crisis that have dominated more recent discussions. They're quite absent here. Plum's concern was in effect with the consequences of specialization and a fear that work in history, philosophy, literature, and so on was now failing to engage general readers or to instruct them in how to live. So, in effect, what is happening here is the humanities are seen as a group of studies that had until recently provided the core of the education for a governing class, but had now retreated into an arid form of professionalism. All the themes that recur in our more recent discussions, you can see, I think, outlines of in these earlier publications. Well, I won't pursue further examples of that, but you can see there's an instability about the main categories across time and place. And I would say, just to repeat, that I think the defining other of the humanities, the enterprise whose rise led to the attempt to delimit this relatively modern category, was at least as much the social sciences as the natural sciences. The opposition between letters and science was, of course, an old one, but as I say, organizationally, that really spawned in the 19th and 20th century the usage of the arts to encompass the non-sciences. I have to say also, it's not so clear that even now the term the humanities has become completely well understood in society at large. There was a social survey done some years ago in the United States that asked people in the street what they understood by the term. And I have to say this threw up a rather disconcerting range of answers, including the person who said the humanities meant singing in the shower. So, the general currency of the term is relatively recent, and then there's the further point that there's still no complete stability in the range of subjects it's understood to encompass. History, for example, in some universities is classified as one of the social sciences. Linguistics, sometimes seen as belonging to the humanities, often has one foot in the natural sciences, one in the social sciences. Divinity, where it exists, is often, especially in the United States, part of a divinity school, a practice-related professional school, more on organizational par with a business school or a law school. And philosophy is everywhere a classificatory conundrum, isn't it? Sometimes being seen as the immediate neighbor of mathematics, sometimes a methodological condensation of the sciences, sometimes a series of meta-inquiries into the nature of inquiry itself, and so on, but very hard to classify institutionally. So I think one upshot of these different forms of instability about which subjects are included has meant that literature, especially the discipline of English literature, has come to function as the one pure standard bearer for the humanities. And that's had obvious consequences for the kinds of characterization and justification that are then offered. My own view is that we all have a lot to lose if the case for the humanities is in practice reduced to the extremely doubtful proposition that we shall all be made better people by reading King Lear or Middlemarch. And I have to say, I think a quick glance at the inmates of the offices on the average departmental corridor would surely be enough to cast doubt on the idea that the study of the humanities makes us better people. Still, whatever the uncertainties about the exact meaning and scope of the term, clearly the humanities is now an established classificatory label, picking out at least some of the more traditional academic disciplines. So let me now bring us up to the present. As many of you may know, it's very common these days to hear the word humanities used in a compound form to indicate a new subfield, such as medical humanities, legal humanities, or very importantly now digital humanities, or one that I only encountered this year, blue humanities, which seems to be the study of the part played by the oceans and seas in human history, or even perhaps water more generally. And above all, of course, there is now global humanities, because no subject can fail if you put global in front of it. Personally, I think most of these are largely positive developments. And we have to recognize that one way that forms of humanistic inquiry will continue to flourish is by way of such interdisciplinary enterprises. The one caution I would enter in relation to that is that for interdisciplinary projects to succeed, you must first have healthy disciplines. So to take an obvious example, philosophers can make essential contributions to medical humanities in terms of analyzing key terms, raising central ethical issues, understanding what can be meant by a satisfactory life, and so on. But for them to be able to make their distinctive contributions, they must first have been educated in and have a thorough grounding in the fundamentals of philosophical reasoning and the classics of moral philosophy. And for something like that, some form of department of philosophy surely will continue to be the best base, especially for the education of graduate students. And I think the fashion for attaching PhD studentships to large interdisciplinary projects, which funding patterns currently encourage, is not so likely to provide the necessary grounding for the graduate students in question who need to become masters of a particular discipline. Still, as I say, I think most of these compound enterprises are to be welcomed. There's one which I think we should be a little more cautious about, and that is what is now called, following usage in the United States, public humanities. Now, this has attracted a lot of interest in the last 2 or 3 years, with several programs in American universities under this label, and in fact a new journal published by Cambridge University Press was launched this year with that title. Now, the development of this particular subdiscipline, if that's what it is, surely reflects what social scientists call the legitimation crisis of modern universities. Because, after all, the rise of public humanities, we should recognize, has coincided more or less with a shrinkage in humanities departments. And both are effects of this same crisis of legitimation. And I'm not going to go into it in detail, but everyone here, I think, can see that this is the effect of deeper shifts in society, shifts in the structure of employment, and so on. So in these circumstances, proponents of public humanities claim that the value of scholarly work needs to be demonstrated to wider publics, undeniable, that communities outside the university must be engaged and cooperated with, perhaps desirable, that pressing contemporary problems must be addressed, rather debatable. To avoid misunderstanding, let me be completely clear that these can all be good and worthwhile activities in their own right. You don't need me to tell you that there are many pressing issues in the world today, and we need all our resources, practical and intellectual, to try to address them. As citizens, engagement and cooperation are without question desirable activities. But the public humanities claims more than this. It claims that the priority for the scholarly disciplines in the humanities is to address the agendas of communities outside universities. Now, I realize there are two very predictable difficulties in talking about this topic. First, you can easily seem as though you're showing off some kind of ostrich-like complacency. Don't you realize people can say, the humanities are fighting for their lives these days, so of course we have to do everything we can to mobilize public support, work with other communities, and demonstrate our social worth. And of course, the second difficulty is you can be accused of denying the value of activities other than scholarship. Again, you can say, don't you realize it's a good thing to attempt to combat social injustice, try to give a voice to the voiceless in our societies, attempt to address the global problems we all face, and so on. But those objections, I think, miss the point here, if you know what public humanities actually stands for. Of course, it's good to do many of these things, and of course the values of justice, equality, sustainability, and so on are good things in themselves. But the point is that in neither case are those the things that scholarship in the humanities primarily does. And I emphasize primarily. If your primary goal is, for example, to relieve hunger in parts of the world where people are starving, you would not be best advised to devote all your time to editing the text of a little-known Renaissance poet. But if you commend a scholar for concentrating on such an edition, it doesn't mean you're indifferent to starvation in the world, or even that you may not be trying to make a contribution to it and its alleviation by other means. The point is you should not kid yourself that fighting malnourishment in the world or resolving any other current social issue is the point or justification of the scholarly editing task itself. Now, I was thinking that may sound like rather a cheap victory. No one surely believes anything so implausible in the first place, you may say. But actually, the logic of much of the celebration in the last 2 or 3 years of public humanities has just that structure of argument. Goals which are very desirable in themselves and which can be argued to be in some way furthered by aspects of work in the humanities, then come to figure as A, showing the value of scholarship, and B, as being an obligatory engagement for any scholar. And I think those claims are not true. So let me make 3 quick points here before I move on. And first, this question of value. Public humanities, I think, cannot, as is sometimes claimed, demonstrate the value of the humanities. It demonstrates some desirable forms of usefulness that can result as a byproduct from having the enterprise of the humanities in good health in the first place. So it may possibly be true, for example, that having read Thucydides on the Peloponnesian War may assist someone to become a better negotiator in cases of intercommunal conflict in the 21st century. But that's not why classical scholars devote years of their lives to studying that text. And, the crucial point, it does not demonstrate the value of their doing that. An incidental byproduct of an activity may be something desirable, but it cannot of itself demonstrate the value of that activity. I want to use here an example I've cited before. Something has clearly gone wrong with our reasoning if we say that the value of learning to play the Beethoven piano sonatas lies in the way it makes us better typists. Of course, it may indeed have that incidental effect because it increases manual dexterity. But that cannot be the reason the activity is pursued in the first place. And anyway, if you want to become better typists, there are much shorter and simpler routes to doing so than that. The value of the humanities, briefly, lies in extending and deepening understanding of matters of human interest and cultural inheritance, thereby building up a body of systematic knowledge about them, and not in solving immediate practical problems. That leads on to my second point about it, the question of the various publics one might try to address. I think it's always important to think of publics in the plural rather than thinking that there is some external monolith called the public. We're now sometimes told that what we write should always aim to reach the widest possible public. But I think that's not really true. We should aim to reach the widest relevant public. But in the case of much scholarly work, that public is going to be a rather restricted group of fellow scholars and students. It makes no sense to say that an article in, say, the Journal of Solid-State Physics should reach a wide public. Only a small number of people could even understand it, let alone judge its significance. Now, of course, it may seem that some work in the humanities, because it's not expressed in a highly technical or mathematical language, ought to be intelligible to any reasonably educated person. But I think that still perpetuates the same error. Progress in scholarship is initially made by exposing new research and new ideas to those capable of evaluating them. And in any given case, that is likely to be a relatively small number of people. In that sense, intellectual progress depends on specialization. And my third point, consider the familiar claim that what we must all be doing is addressing pressing social problems, or what the European funding agencies tend to call the grand challenges of our time. But is that what scholars, as scholars, should be doing? What counts as a pressing societal issue is so often just something that sections of the media and political world are currently talking about. I think we should never forget that what features in the media, including social media, does not constitute reality or the present, or even less that mythical construct, the real world. It's a selection from a vast range of human experience of a few topics that are amplified by being repeated in media that command large audiences. I noticed a few weeks ago a sentence in a leading article in The Guardian which said, "Any novelist writing today must address the climate crisis." I actually think that's a rather foolish sentence, not of course because the climate crisis is not a matter of grave consequence for the human and other forms of life on the planet, but because the very nature of imaginative writing surely requires that writers be free to address or ignore any topic. And it's not for a serious-minded journalist or anyone else to prescribe what they must write about. And I think something similar applies to scholarly work in the humanities. If your priority in life is to try to help to reduce the extreme levels of inequality that disfigure our current societies, and that certainly seems to me an entirely admirable goal, then go ahead and join a campaigning group or work for a radical think tank or become a crusading journalist or go into politics or whatever. But I don't think we should try to persuade ourselves that extending scholarly understanding of, say, 18th century novels or medieval agricultural practices or piano works of Chopin is, by some mysterious indirect means, an equally important way to combat contemporary inequality. The attempt to build a radical political purpose directly into scholarly work is, I think, too often an expression of bad conscience about the privileges of academic life. And these, again, as I mentioned, are all issues, I think, symptomatic of the legitimation crisis currently besetting universities in general and the humanities in particular. Now, it's hard to listen to a lecture, isn't it, for a long time, so let's have a 2 seconds break, and you can wiggle your toes or however you do it. Take a deep breath, and I'm going to move on to something different. Stop wiggling your toes now, please. Everything I've discussed so far, as you can see, deals with questions of argument, presentation, and persuasion. I want now to turn to a different level of analysis, more about a series of facts and pieces of information, but which still, I think, supports my rather skeptical view about the value of justifications for the humanities that are couched in overly ambitious terms. I want to look at some facts concerning the actual position of humanities disciplines in Europe and the United States over the past 3 generations. And we can begin with the question of student enrollments, that is, the choices that applicants and then undergraduate students make about which courses of study to follow. There's been a lot of good work on this, done by historians, done by historical Roger Geiger in the USA and Peter Mandler in Britain. And their research shows that despite repeated alarms about an alleged crisis of the humanities, student numbers in the humanities in both these countries did not, in fact, reveal any catastrophic decline in the 65 years between 1945 and about 2010. If anything, the reverse was the case. And again, there were quite a few local and temporary variations. Now, several factors contributed to that picture. One was the increasing feminization of the student body over these years, with female students somewhat more likely than male students to choose humanities subjects, especially languages, literature, and art. Another enormously important, I think, factor was the perception that employers believed a good education in humanities subjects was a suitable preparation for the forms of employment in which they were trying to recruit. That's not a straightforward matter, and in some cases the perception may not have corresponded to reality. But as long as potential students believed that they would not be penalized in the job market for having studied humanities subjects, then enrollment numbers held up. And a third big determinant was what happened in schools. Some of the major disciplines, such as history and literature, were central to secondary school education across these decades, and that encouraged numbers of students to study these subjects at university. You can see how decisive this factor can be when we look at the decision of the British government in the early 2000s to make the study of a modern foreign language no longer compulsory in secondary education. This had a dramatic impact on numbers choosing to do degrees in modern languages, to the extent that the university study of literature in all European languages other than Spanish and French is now almost at risk of dying out, although of course there are other things that contribute to that position. And then there are some broad patterns common to most European and European-influenced societies, where the expansion of higher education is concerned in the second half of the 20th century and the first decade of the 21st. One common feature is that new institutions that were founded in these years with the intention of developing a new and distinctive educational model increasingly came to imitate the dominant established models, though usually without the same status. Up until at least the 1990s, this favoured humanities disciplines because they were seen to be one of the defining characteristics of the traditional institutions. Another common feature is that the first phases of this expansion, especially in the 1960s and 1970s, largely increased the recruitment from the same advantaged sections of society. The most significant change in those years was the big increase in the number of daughters, rather than just sons, of the middle class who went into higher education. Another development, which, as I said, I think favoured humanities disciplines, or at least some of them. Recruitment on a large scale from the less privileged social strata only really started to happen in British universities from the end of the 1990s and into the 2000s. If the pattern of student enrollment was broadly positive for the humanities up to 2000 or 2010 and beyond, there has obviously seemed to be a marked change in the past decade, though it may be too early to say how significant or how permanent this apparent decline in numbers of humanities students will turn out to be. But here too, scholarly research offers some useful, longer perspectives. There is, for example, some evidence to suggest that the higher the proportion of the age cohort that is enrolled in higher education in any given country, the lower the proportion studying humanities subjects will be. Moreover, the figures suggest that the higher concentrations of humanities students will be found in the most selective institutions, even if lower status institutions offer the same range of subjects. Now, a lot of elements come into play here, which I'm not going to go into in any great detail, but it obviously includes the fact that students from more privileged backgrounds are more likely to see a degree in humanities subjects as a consolidation of advantages in terms of cultural capital, whereas those from social strata new to higher education are on the whole more likely to be anxious that they will need relevant expert qualifications for the job market if they are to compensate for having attended less highly regarded universities. As many of you may know, in the UK, the evidence suggests that the top employers are more influenced by the perceived standing of the university that job applicants attended than by the subject they studied. And of course, that's a tendency that may work to the advantage of humanities subjects in the so-called elite institutions, while also serving, of course, to perpetuate social advantage. And in fact, I think now a more specific worry that we might have in this connection is that students, and eventually scholars, in many of these disciplines are likely to be increasingly recruited from the offspring of the privileged classes. That's already true to a considerable extent in this country of disciplines such as art history and classics, and perhaps is becoming true of subjects like modern languages and music. But overall, a point to emphasize here is that the evidence does not suggest that student enrollment is at all responsive to large-scale statements about the value of the humanities, either by government ministers or education journalists or people like me, but rather that it's determined by a range of much more substantial social and economic factors. That once celebrated 1964 book that I mentioned earlier, Crisis in the Humanities, contained essays by distinguished contributors, some of the leading scholars of the day, announcing that these disciplines faced extinction unless they radically mended their ways. In practice, this announcement of a near-terminal crisis roughly coincided with one of the largest expansions of numbers of both scholars and students in the humanities there has ever been. I think we should be careful about ascribing too strong a causal role to pronouncements either in the past or in the present. Now, taking a wider perspective still, we shall of course hear more in the immediate future about the need for a global view. And here just one thing I want to say that I think is important to emphasize, and that is that the relation of many humanities disciplines to their native cultures will always remain more intimate than that of other disciplines. Most work in the natural sciences, and even in many of the social sciences, can be pursued anywhere, and in a global economy will by and large be pursued where funding dictates. But the study and teaching of, say, Danish history is always likely to be particularly pursued in Denmark, or Portuguese literature, particularly in Portugal, and so on. And I think that's a reminder from another angle that these inquiries are more continuous with interests and debates in the wider non-academic culture of which they are a part. The future of, for example, art history will be considerably affected by what happens to galleries and museums. The future of the study of literature may be by what happens to literary publishing, literary journalism, and so on. A narrow focus on funding policies for undergraduate education, I think, risks our losing sight of some of the larger forces in our culture that have given these subjects their vitality and their wider appeal. So, my title, Looking to the Future. Well, we can all have guesses here. Mine are no more than that. Certainly, I think in terms of numbers of both students and staff, and in terms of their influence on decisions within processes of university education, the humanities disciplines are likely to be a more reduced presence in higher education systems in, let's say, 2050 and beyond than they have been in the past 50 years. And there's clearly a risk that across the world they may be largely confined to the major research universities and more elite colleges. I don't think that they will again have the centrality they had in the middle and later decades of the 20th century. Partly because so many other subjects have grown up, and therefore the proportion, the power, as it were, of having a very large proportion of students in a university is going to decline for all the existing subjects. In Britain, not in Britain alone, the figures suggest that some mixture of business and management studies is one of the most popular subjects at undergraduate level, as well as computing studies and law, the three which tend to come out on top. And that obviously reflects wider changes in society over the past 2 or 3 decades. And I don't think those changes are going to come to an end. It's also the case, as I hinted earlier, that the democratization of higher education in most countries has seen the traditional academic subjects, and interestingly not just the humanities, but the traditional subjects in the pure sciences, like physics and chemistry, has seen them decline because they're less popular among the social groups now entering higher education for the first time. I noticed a very striking figure in The Guardian's University Guide that came out 3 weeks ago. And that was, take a contrast here, on the one hand, no fewer than 41 of the 45, in other words, almost all the institutions offering degrees in hospitality, event management, and tourism only became universities from the 1990s onwards, whereas none of the 23 institutions that offer classics belongs to that category. That, I think, is a worrying divide. Looking at things more sociologically, also, I think you could say that we're witnessing the shift from the university as shaped by the social democratic era, with a few aristocratic residues still active, to the university as reflecting the era of the politics of market individualism. And in these circumstances, surely it would be unrealistic to expect the humanities disciplines to be able to continue to benefit from the older kind of deference to the inherited ideals of culture that they did. But I don't think we should let these political and economic pressures drive us into misdescribing the purpose of learning more about any of these things, history, literature, philosophy, or whatever. And this is, I think, where this question of the logic of justification can lead us astray. As I've said, there's a tendency for defenders of universities in general, and the humanities in particular, to want to present them as contributing to every approved social good. But that seems to me a mistake, both as a matter of fact and as a matter of tactics. We may believe that social mobility, whatever we think that means, is a good thing. We may believe that respecting the views of less privileged groups, however we interpret that, is a good thing. But we'd be foolish to try to justify the study of humanities in terms of those larger goals, because, as I indicated, those outcomes can at best be byproducts of the work of a university, not its defining aim. I think all of us engaged in education may hope that in helping to extend cultural understanding, we're not narrowing human sympathies. But there may be no necessary connection in either direction. The fact that someone can make a dazzling breakthrough in the understanding of human behavior, while at the same time behaving abominably in other aspects of life and holding deplorable political views, that may make us uncomfortable, but I think it's a combination universities have to live with, because the extension of understanding is their primary activity, not the manufacturing of right-mindedness. And anyway, thinking of the future, the truth is that although the humanities form a relatively small part even of the modern research university, they bulk very large in all discussions about the idea or future of universities. And I think that's not simply because those who dilate on these matters are drawn disproportionately from humanities disciplines. I think it may be in part because the discourse about the humanities has now become a locus and in some sense a placeholder for wider anxieties about the changing relations between culture and democracy, between society and economy. These anxieties have real objects as well, as like all anxieties, they're exaggerated or phantasmatic features. But what I've tried to bring out so far is that we should not encourage this only partly conscious use of the category of the humanities as a way of addressing these wider issues. Not least because it tends to make much of the discourse about the humanities, as I said at the beginning, simultaneously too pious, but also too defensive. I think we have good reason to be more modest, but then I think we have every reason to be more confident. So let me conclude. Across the first 3 quarters of the 20th century, excuse me, universities in Britain continued to benefit from a widespread deference to traditional cultural ideals. During that period, the mainstream humanities subjects, such as English and history, continued to square the circle of offering a form of culturally sanctioned self-cultivation that was also likely to serve as a passport to a good job. But in the last 20 years, and especially in the last decade, so many of the conditions that enabled those outcomes have been eroded. We're all aware, I'm sure, here that we now live in a much more competitive, utilitarian, and at least in ethos, if not in outcomes, egalitarian society. The marketization of higher education that began during this period and accelerated at dizzying pace after 2010 has produced institutions that increasingly mirror that form of society. And I see no point in merely lamenting such changes or taking up a Canute-like posture towards forces which are, after all, changing these things all over the world. But that doesn't mean, in my view, that we should despair about this topic. After all, the huge expansion of higher education that we've seen since the 1990s represents, in my view at least, a positive democratic enlargement of possibilities for so many in our society who were previously excluded from such benefits. Then, moreover, alongside such changes, curiosity about the human world, about the past, about imaginative creations, about fundamental existential questions, and so on, is not going to disappear. The flourishing of book groups and literary festivals, of podcasts and online cultural journals, historical dramas and participant archaeology, and much, much more, all this testifies, I think, to a continuing appetite for such matters in society at large. These activities, of course, only engage certain sections of society, and equally, of course, parents, governments, and the media will continue to impress on school leavers the priority of studying something that they believe will guarantee them a decent job after graduation. But even there, things may not be as they seem. So-called decent or good jobs are becoming, and will increasingly become, scarcer as the digitalization of labor processes increases, especially including, of course, the as yet barely untapped potential of artificial intelligence. So even on pragmatic rather than idealist grounds, it may become more and more sensible to choose to study at university something that will expand one's horizons and deepen one's understanding in a way that will continue to enrich experience throughout life and make one adaptable, rather than to study a restricted practical subject that seems to promise a job, the one that may turn out to be tediously repetitive and that may anyway well disappear in the next stage of technological innovation. Obviously, we predict at our peril, and as historians like to say, the future is not my period. But I would urge us to be realistic rather than pessimistic. Yes, the place of humanities subjects in the contemporary university is shrinking, and we have to acknowledge the pain and loss that's involved in that process. But interest in history, philosophy, literature, and so on remains strong, and there are deep human needs and interests involved in understanding such matters. And it's up to, I think, to schools and universities to communicate the appeal and significance of such subjects without expecting them to recover the unchallenged prominence in the curriculum that they once had. And here, the category of the humanities may be as much a burden as a help. Better perhaps to say, here's what's so fascinating about this piece of historical research, or here's what's so compelling about this rigorously pursued philosophical argument, or here's what's so illuminating about this particular way of reading this text, and so on. The more we focus on the positive qualities of such particular pieces of work, and the more we attend to the range of human responses that they continue to elicit, the less we're likely to surrender to media-driven doom scrolling about the alleged crisis in the humanities. Thank you.